So March 15th, 2020 turned out to be the first kind of coronavirus Sunday. We had heard that this might be coming and that it might have a direct impact on our churches, and it definitely did this morning. Churches across the country and right here in Pittsburgh all kind of went scrambling to try and figure out what to do to balance public health and the need to continue to worship together as God's people. A lot of churches decided to close. Some churches decided to stay open for this week and are looking at closing in the future. And I had the privilege of going out to Crossroads Presbyterian Church in Monroeville. I was scheduled to preach there anyway. And their session was actually meeting right after to decide what they want to do long term. But it's not the normal sermon I ended up preaching there. Normally, this was kind of an official visit in my role as Presbyterian staff, and normally I talk about the importance of maintaining momentum during pastoral transitions and everything like that. And that didn't seem to be an appropriate message to preach. Fortunately, the lectionary helped us out today with Romans 5. As I tried to balance Romans 5 and the need to be careful and to take precautions seriously, but also keep in mind that in the midst of uncertain times, God's faithfulness is what holds us together and helps us endure. So I hope you enjoy. It's been quite a week, hasn't it? I remember on New Year's Eve reading a news story about this weird virus that they discovered in China. And now here we are, a mere 10 weeks later, in near total shutdown out of something that happened literally half a world away. As of today, the NBA, the NHL, and Major League Baseball are all on hiatus. March Madness is canceled. The Pittsburgh CLO even has suspended all their operations and more. My kids have 2 weeks off from school. My wife's office is closed starting tomorrow. Mine is closed starting Wednesday. Wow. My son and I were driving yesterday to pick up our Saturday evening pizza, takeout of course, with extensive hand washing after we returned home. And my son said, "I know I'm going to remember this." He's 12. And for sure, the next 2 weeks at the very least will be etched into his memory. And if you think about it, many of you can think of defining moments in our history. For years, my grandparents and parents could tell me the exact moment where they were and who they were with when they found out that JFK had been assassinated. For those of us who weren't there for that, some of you will recall exactly where you were when you heard about the Challenger exploding. For those of us who weren't there for that, you can recall exactly where you were on 9/11. And so, hopefully in far less dramatic fashion, we will remember the coronavirus of 2020 for years to come. And what's interesting about crisis situations is there's almost this predictable cycle of what happens when they happen, right? The stock market tanks. That's the first thing. And we respond by doing two things. The first is that we shop. We shop, right? We shop. Now, I'm not making fun of anyone for shopping, because I'm enough of a pre-panic planner that I was hitting Target 2 weeks ago when they still had hand sanitizer and Lysol wipes. So I'm not judging or making fun of anybody, but I was reading last night, and this rang true, in situations in which we feel as though we have no control, one of the ways that humans exercise their control is by doing what they can. And in a very real way, stocking up on toilet paper and milk and bread and whatever else you can find makes us feel like we've at least done something in situations in which we find that we lack control. And the second is that we turn to God in prayer. I do not know if there was a more full Sunday in any of our churches than the Sunday after 9/11. There was this massive drive, this massive question of what is this, what has happened, and in the midst of today, the same question is, what are we facing? And in the midst of when we lack control, we look for something that looks to be beyond ourselves, that looks to be a greater power than us. This past week, I was in San Francisco And I was with a group of about 40 people, most of whom were not Christian. And I spent most of my life as a pastor around people who at least ostensibly are Christian, and most of whom are passionately Christian. And it was amazing for me to sit in that room as we talked about the virus and the spread and what was ahead, to hear people using language that even for them, as people not of faith, they were drawn to. They talk about the universe and the energy in the universe being on our side. They'd speak vaguely of faith. And for some, they would even say, if there is a God, now is the time that we need God the most. Now, I had to do my best, be on my best behavior, to not say, oh, you need God more today than you did yesterday? But I didn't do that. You all should be very proud of me, but I need to confess that to you all. Thank you. Because the truth is, we don't need God more today than we did yesterday. We don't need God more today than we did last week or even last month. We don't need God more now than we did back in October, when this virus hadn't even surfaced. But yet there is something about situations like this that we face that draw us to a reflection upon who we are in God's eyes. Therefore, I thought it was fitting that the lectionary reading for this week comes from Romans. Romans is Paul's most theologically complicated, layered, and developed book of the New Testament. It covers tons of themes. His understanding of sin, the work of Jesus, the relationship between Jews and Gentiles. It is all there. And in the smack dab in the middle almost of Romans 5, Paul has developed out his arguments about the problem of sin and the work of Jesus, and he moves into Romans 5. Romans 5 has for me been a passage that over the course of many years I've been drawn to, because there's something powerful about this passage. There's something challenging about it. And there's something, well, downright surprising about it. But before we get to this, let me ask you something. Have you ever spent a decent amount of time looking for something only to discover it was right in front of your face? As a child, I used to think it was hilarious to watch my mother look for her glasses when they were right here. As I grew, I actually would not tell her because it was funnier to just kind of sit there and be like, Mom. Oh, they're right there. 2 weeks ago, I was sitting in my office frantically looking for a pen that I knew I had. I knew it was right there. And it was right in my mouth. Won't be doing that anytime soon, by the way. I just said that and was like, oh. Coronavirus heard that and washed their hands. Stole that joke from Trevor Noah, just to be clear. Or the time that we were walking through the mall and we looked around and we had lost our daughter. Is there any worse experience than losing a kid in a public place? Where was she? And I frantically began to look. And I was like, where's Meredith? And this little voice goes, here. She was right behind me. Like right behind me, right where you'd want a kid to be. Sometimes the most obvious answers are staring us right in the face. And that's kind of how Paul approaches this part of Romans. You see, for Jews in the first century, the core question was, how is it that we please God? What is it that we must do in order to be righteous in God's eyes? That was the defining question. And amongst Jews in the first century, there were a litany of different ways to answer that question. There were the answers of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and various rabbis and schools of thinking that differed in how they answered that question. But Paul's answer to the question of how is it that we please God, how is it that we are judged righteous in God's eyes, is startlingly simple. Nothing. We do nothing. It is God that has done what needs to be done. It is God that has reached out to us, not us who needs to reach out to God. In the work of Jesus Christ, Paul says, we are justified. We didn't do anything. It was done on our behalf, in our place. You see, unlike a conventional religious to-do list, it says, here are the 5, 7, 19, 21, 27, or 635 things that you must do in order to please God. Paul says, you don't do anything. God has done what needs to be done. And in times like this, of uncertainty and fright and panic, I think it's important to remember this. God's love isn't something that we earn. God's love isn't something that we strive after to achieve, to earn God's acceptance. God's love is something that is given. It's given to us, not earned. It's simply given. With that established, with this idea established, that what we do to please God is nothing, that God has done what needs to be done, and that we merely accept it and live into that, Paul answers the question. So what then does it matter? If it's something that we don't earn, then what's the value of it? And what Paul says is that we obtain something through that. We obtain hope. That the byproduct of what God has done for us has brought hope into the world. Hope. Hope that something could be different. Hope that something could be better. Hope that for something more. Hope in this life and in the next. Hope. Because after all, if God can raise a man from the dead, then God can do anything. That's the grounding of our hope. The grounding of our hope that we have for life is that God loves us, and out of that love we have hope. So far so good, right? You don't need to earn God's love. It's a gift that you're given. Receive the gift and live a life in hope. Let's all go home. But Paul doesn't let us off the hook so early. He says this, and this, to be honest, bothers me. And I'll explain why in a minute. Paul suddenly begins to draw a line. He says, not only should we boast in hope, we should boast in our sufferings. Whoa, hold up. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I understand the boasting and hope thing, but boasting in sufferings, boasting in the bad things that happen. And Paul then draws this line. He says, look, suffering produces endurance. Endurance produces character. And character produces hope. And hope doesn't disappoint because God's love has been made manifest through the Spirit. Now, the reason I'm so uncomfortable with this line of thinking, this idea of boasting in our sufferings, that boasting produces endurance, endurance produces character, character produces hope. The reason I'm so uncomfortable with it is that it gets dangerously close to this idea of, well, everything happens for a reason. Which, by the way, is not in the Bible. No, that's actually not at all what the Bible says. That's not at all what Paul is trying to say. Everything does not have a reason, or at least it doesn't have a good reason. But this is a teaching that we can take heart in. And let me explain with an illustration. When I started middle school, I was about 5'4" and weighed about 90 pounds, soaking wet. That meant, as far as sports go, I had one option: running. Anything else that involved contact, I bounced off someone like a dead mosquito when they ran into me. So soccer and football were out. So I ran. I ran for 6 years, 18 seasons of running. And we would do hard workouts some days. Monday was what was called intervals day. And on intervals day, the coach would put a whistle in his mouth. I still hate that whistle. And he'd blow it. And we would run our guts out for 3 minutes. And then the whistle would go again. And the next group would go. We'd get 3 minutes to recover. And then he'd blow that whistle again. And we'd start off running again. So for all these years, every Monday, I knew I was headed for a hard workout. But what was interesting and what I learned as I got more into the science of running was the value of doing those workouts wasn't just the physical value. Yes, training hard, the physical training of running, helped build our endurance and our strength. That's true. But there was something else that we learned. And what it was after you'd been running for 27 total minutes, your legs are exhausted, you can barely catch your breath, and that whistle goes again, you discover that you still have the strength in you to do it again. It develops a mental endurance and a willingness to see a challenge and to push through it. So that in a race, when you're 3 laps into a 4-lap race and you are dying, you know, hey, I've been through this before. I can do this. I can push through this last lap. There's something about endurance training that reminds us that we are stronger than we realize. What Paul is saying here, follow me, is similar. His point is that the suffering that we face builds up our endurance then builds into character, and our character builds up into hope. And that hope is formed, why? Because we know what God has done for us in the past. We are not asked as the people of God to place our hope in ourselves. We are not asked as the people of God to place our hope in anyone other than God Himself. It's not a random concept of hope, but it's a hope that is grounded in what God has done in the past. As I said a few minutes ago, if God raised a man from the dead, then there is hope in any situation. On Sundays when I lead communion, I often will start out by saying, you all believe God raised a man from the dead, right? And the congregation go. And I stop and I say, wait a minute. You all actually believe that God raised a man from the dead, right? And then they'll start to get on the big, yeah. And I'll say, really? I'll do it one more time and I'll say, you all really believe that God raised a man from the dead? And at this point, because they want to get home before 12:30, they begin to say, yeah, we do. Just serve communion already. But I think there's a point there I don't want us to lose. God raised a man from the dead, and the tomb is still empty. So yeah, is coronavirus serious? Absolutely. Am I messing around with it? No, I'm not. But it's not our Lord. It's not our God. It doesn't control us. There's only one God. There's only one power that raised a man from the dead. And we need to keep that in mind. Wednesday night was when everything went haywire in this country. And typical Americans, no one took this seriously until the NBA called off their season. And suddenly we're all like, oh shoot, sports are stopping? We better pay attention. March Madness dropped, the NHL suspended, which by the way, I know as Pens fans, you might have been a little sad about that. As a Sabres fan, your season has collapsed. Hey, all for it, we can't lose. The stock market continued to plunge. The presidential address, I'm not being political here, did nothing to allay fears at all. I don't know what we wanted him to say, really, but just saying nothing was going well. And I'm sitting with a group of my colleagues now in Nashville, and I am beginning to feel the anxiety building in my stomach. My mother has a phrase, I'm not worried about something, I'm not happy. And unfortunately, the heredity, I got that too. If I'm not worried about something, I'm not happy. And finally, I went, you know what, I just need to get away. I need to put the dumb phone down. I need to stop reading what's happening in Italy. I need to get my head out of this space. So I decided I would do something productive, and I would look at my lectionary readings for Sunday. Oh boy. So I pulled out my iPad, I opened up, and I read Romans 5, and I was like, oh Jesus, you're so funny. I have to go preach a sermon on having hope in the midst of a stressful time. Thanks. They often say that every sermon that a preacher preaches, they're actually preaching to themselves. There's something to that, by the way. I've heard some people this week say we need to live in faith and not in fear. We need to live in faith and not in fear. I know. But that doesn't make the fear less real. So where do I want to leave you today? Twofold. Number one, don't be reckless. This thing is real. This is what they say it is. And my hope is in 4 weeks or 2 weeks or whenever, we all go, man, what? That really seemed to be much ado about nothing. That's the hope, folks. That's the hope. The hope is in 4 weeks or whenever they begin to lift all this mandatory quarantining, people can say, why did we do all that? It was so we someday could say, why did we do all that? But I do want you to live in faith and not in fear. Living in faith doesn't mean not taking it seriously. Living in faith doesn't mean being reckless or, dare I even say, stupid. Living in faith means keeping everything in perspective, keeping everything in balance, so that we do everything. We wash our hands, we use hand sanitizer, we travel as little as we need to, we stay at home when possible, we go online for meetings, we practice social distancing, right? I'm practicing my 6 feet of separation right now. We're all good right now. But what I want us to keep in mind is, in the face of the most uncertain and challenging times, that the tomb is still empty. God is still the source of our hope. And that hope is not built on an empty promise, but is built on the promise of an empty tomb and 2,000 plus years of God's faithfulness, to remind us that even in the most difficult of times, God is still present, God is still at work, God is still doing new things. And it is my hope and my prayer that in these uncertain and challenging times, that we, as the people of God, might demonstrate a soundness of mind and a depth of compassion that serves for the healing and the hope of the world. In Jesus' name, amen.